Hi, I'm Will Webb, and this is Why You Should Watch. In this episode, we're discussing French queer horror Knife+Heart, directed by Yann Gonzalez.
C'est un de ses amis qui a découvert le corps.
Carl venait de tourner dans un de mes films.
Quel genre de film exactement?
Oh, arrêtez votre charme. Faites pas le coup des types qui sont pas renseignés.
Dans 2 minutes, je veux tous à poil et au garde à vous, plus raide que Giscard. On se soulage avec la main, on est à l'aise entre copains.
The film follows Anne, a producer of gay porn films, who's dealing with a messy breakup while trying to finish her latest movie. Then a former star of a previous picture is horrifically murdered by a masked killer. Anne incorporates this into her new movie, pushing boundaries of taste and ethics, as well as the morale of her crew. When more actors are murdered, she's forced to investigate to try and unmask the killer. Joining me for this chat is Elle Haywood, who is a freelance film critic and curator based outside London.
So I first encountered Knife+Heart. In French, it's Un couteau dans le cœur. Finally got that right. In Cannes in 2018. It was my first time at kind of the big festival. I'd only just emerged out of being a student writer. I didn't really have much of a clue of what the festival lineup was going to be. This was one of the first films I saw and I just became completely absorbed by it. It's so indulgently queer. It plays tribute to kind of cult horror arena, but it's also really emotional. So I was really taken aback and I sat with it for a while and just kind of felt shocked by it, but I started to kind of think over all of the beautiful elements that kind of build up this really intrinsic storyline. So yeah, shock is kind of the first word I think a lot of people encounter when they watch the film, because it plays around with different genre conventions that people don't entirely expect, which it makes it all the more exciting as a thriller.
So it definitely has that astonishing opening sequence, which I think is, well, yeah, absolutely shocking and really kind of sears into the eye, where the killer is sort of tracking this guy in a nightclub, and then they go back for some submissive queer sex, where the killer uses a hidden knife inside a dildo to murder the other guy. And I was watching this, obviously the first thing that comes to mind, as we've spoken about, is giallo, the Italian 70s and 80s film genre, which is all about kind of the intersection between sexuality and violence in what we now call a slasher film. I think about giallo sometimes as being like Hitchcock, with the subtext made plain. So with that in mind, I think this is like giallo with that subtext kind of taken and then put in bold and like underlined several times right at the center of it. I think that also maybe the less likely thing about it is that it's not quite like the giallo as most people know it, with those kind of shiny gloved killers. The main killer is a very like traditional giallo character in the sense that he's masked, he's wearing like leather, there's all that signifying stuff there. But actually it reminded me less of the traditional giallos and more of I'm not sure how familiar you are with the genre, but Lucio Fulci, who's one of the main kind of giallo makers in the later period, one of the more brutal ones, becomes basically the beginner of the slasher sequences. He goes over to New York and makes a number of kind of movies about the seedy sexual underbelly of New York. And that's much more like this. You get movies like Cruising as well with Al Pacino that kind of like touch on those elements too.
This is exactly it. It plays around with the kind of the typical 70s conventions of giallo. So if you're kind of looking into the history of it with something like Maria Bava's Blood and Black Lace, it has got those kind of stylistic elements. It's not completely, kind of laced up gloves, and there's bits of it put in there, but it's also completely emboldened with these kind of neon colors. It pays ode to how the giallo period affected American slashers within the 80s and 90s. But also what an intrinsic part of it is that kind of Hitchcockian noir detective-y vibe. There's that kind of murder mystery that plays around with the ideas of kind of high and low art. It isn't afraid to kind of delve really into that kind of the porn world, in a really honest portrayal of it as well, but bring out this kind of like interesting take on sexual violence. Because in the film, with Anne having to deal with the fact that lots of her cast members are being murdered, she kind of slightly sadistically decides that, oh, this would actually make a great kind of plot line for some of our porn like narratives, which is a bit of a shock because a lot of people, I think, go into the film because it's very much centered around her, expecting her to be a much more kind of like gentle character. She's not. She's dealing with a breakup. Her industry is getting affected. She's not kind of getting any support from the police and looking into the murders, all the while being in this completely drunken haze. And so the idea of, oh, right, let's kind of see if we can work this into our own narratives is really strange. But it kind of captures that kind of horribleness to it as well.
When I was first looking at the film back in 2018, was it when it came out? I actually didn't watch it at the time because I thought, okay, I know giallo very well, and I've seen some kind of like pastiches of giallo that annoy me more than they like are interesting. I think about films like Barbarian Sound Studio, which I think is a good movie, but as a giallo fan is like a little bit frustrating sometimes because of how it works. Much more interesting thing that comes up is that Anne starts to incorporate that into her pornography. And for me, the kind of defining feature of a giallo, much more than like the black gloves and all that stuff, is the murder is related to a subtext about what is seen and unseen, and you find that in all the major giallos. But here, it's really brought to the fore with the filmmaking becoming part of it, and so you actually don't get told at certain points what is porn and what isn't until you're a bit further in the scene. Early on, there's a police interrogation that is then followed by another interrogation of one of the main actors in the porn film. And then it turns into a porn scene, and you realize you've been watching a porn version of that scene the whole time. So I thought that there was this interesting thing about drawing a connection between how the film depicted those violent sexualized murders and also like the porn production's restaging of those related events, which obviously reaches a peak with this moment where they stalk and catch the killer, and it turns out to be the porn film, not the film you're watching. It happens only about half an hour into the film. It's a really wild bit of invention.
It's really stunning in the way that it does that, because it makes you kind of reconsider what people's perceptions are of like the porn industry as well. And this is the thing, is the aesthetic stylization is so crucial in a giallo, but also the fact that it does kind of subvert the narrative a lot, because the whole thing is obviously shot on this gorgeous 35mm film, but then a lot of the porn scenes are shot on the kind of slightly softer 16mm. But you don't always notice those transitions between the two. So suddenly when you think, oh my God, have they just uncovered the murder? We're like an hour through. Is this it? And then you realise it kind of pulls away, and you get that kind of experience of the filmmaking in a kind of widest perspective, which is a really fascinating way to kind of play around with a storyline that is so innately complex, but wants to be kind of bigger and bolder and bring in some brighter ideas.
Jan Gonzalez, the filmmaker behind this, very well-known queer filmmaker working in shorts. I think this is his first feature. He like brings that subtext, that queer subtext from the rest of his movies, and the very, very experimental approach there in a really interesting way to giallo, which of course is like, despite having become a kind of critical darling in terms of like, we like to talk about it in film criticism as if it wasn't just movies made cheaply and quickly. They really were these fad films, genre movies. And so he lends that kind of underpinning to it. But talking more about the craft of the film, one thing that really stood out to me was the score, which is by M83.
You normally see kind of a director walk into different roles. Like sometimes there'll be the editor on it as well. There'll be the producer on it. You don't always see them doing the score as much. That's usually a very different department. So Jan Gonzalez and his brother are both part of M83. So have that kind of control over the music is what really drives home the film, because it is such a dreamlike atmosphere, and the electronic kind of brings it this kind of contemporary feel to the entire film. But it's not overdone, which is incredibly important, because with a lot of slashers and horrors, you kind of have that tension build up towards a murder. It's super intense. But the film has to deal with the fact that there's a lot of kind of scenes in queer clubs. So there's a lot of different background music playing, because we see lots of different queer scenes. So we see places in like fetish rooms above cinemas. We've got kind of private hidden same-sex clubs that kind of had to be hidden in Europe at the time. And then you've got this kind of like, there's a lovely scene in which Anne's in a kind of a lesbian bar, which has got like a kind of like theatre portrayal going on. So within all these different scenes, you've got really pounding, impactful music. But then to link it all together, you've got the M83 score, which kind of sounds like chimes and gentle bells that kind of bring it through. And it's got very kind of monotone.
It's like a drone sound,
Yes.
a synth pad that runs underneath the score.
Synth pad, there we go. It's got a like a monotone synth pad that just kind of holds all the way through, and it makes everything carry along together. So when you're transitioning between, when you're pulling out from a porn scene into the kind of set, or when you're kind of going in to the porn scene from the edit suite, those transitions help to cover it. And you find that they are also the way that it knits the storyline together. So one of the beautiful elements of the film is it does this great thing where when the scene is coming to an end, it will fade out obviously into the wall colour of the next room. And that's when the chimes will kind of come in to kind of transition through, which is a very structural element to having an experimental film, but it works.
With that in mind, I wanted to ask you if there's a particular scene or sequence that you think really sets up the tone of the movie, and if so, what would that be? One to recommend to a new viewer of the film.
I think one of the more pivotal scenes, it's very short. So Anne's love interest in the film is Lewis, who is her editor at the company, and everyone else on the porn set is usually kind of down on the ground floor. They're shooting, they're working out sound, they're kind of discussing the narrative of it. She works very solitary up in the top room, and she's sat there with the 60mm, and we see her, I think it's possibly about a third of the way through. She's sat going through the reel. She's kind of a bit apathetic about it. It's the same old story they keep doing. But what she does is every time she goes through, you see these kind of candid pan rounds of like the porn scene has finished shooting, the camera pans around, you kind of see the crew like either clapping or talking. She always pauses on moments of Anne. They've had like tough discussions, they've just been through a breakup, they were together 10 years. And Anne is a big mess over this. So throughout the film, she's constantly kind of pining after her, she's trying to want her back, she's declaring her love. And Lois just kind of sits back the whole time and just says no. But when she's on her own, she sits and looks through these reels, seeing these candid shots of her. And then out of nowhere, there's a message carved in on one of the reels. And I won't say what, because it's a really interesting take. And it really kind of brings together the personal and the emotional element of the film, which is deep, but it exists on top of this kind of slasher narrative. And it's just a really pivotal moment. And also when you see her looking through this editing suite, there's also Anne peeling back a tiny bit of wallpaper to watch her through as well, this kind of peeping Tom element. But not in a creepy way. It's much more kind of this deep love that runs between them still. But their world is so complex, and having to deal with such a myriad of issues alongside a breakup makes it all the more emotional.
When Anne sat there and peeled back that piece of the wall in the other room to look in at Lois, I was really amazed by the corresponding angle where it's a single eye kind of lit in the middle of, I think it's wallpaper, it's like a load of lips. And so her eye is like in the middle of this lip, which I thought was a lovely kind of giallo image. And also I noticed at the end of that sequence that she leaves the projector on a still frame looking at that, and the heat of the bulb burns the film. It burns it straight out, which kind of ruins it. And so that's like a really interesting, another intersection between the texture of the film as an artifact in the world and the story that's being told in it too. Thanks for watching me and Elle chat about Knife+Heart. To hear more of our conversation, including just what makes Vanessa Paradis' performance so amazing, and some spoilery thoughts on the themes behind the film, check out the Indietrix podcast, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and basically anywhere you want to listen to it.